So, how are you today for the second day of the conference? Good? I can see some glowing faces.
Well, I think it's all because of that dinner we had yesterday, right?
Probably well fusion with Mauritian delicacies and music. So I trust you managed to reach your hotel safely and you had some good rest, because if you see the agenda today, it's a very hectic and long one of eating us. Now, before we just kick start, I just want to relate to you a small incident which happened to me yesterday. Unfortunately, when our party ended, I realized I lost my way back home. So I was looking for those liaison persons, but unfortunately, I didn't have anyone. So the only response I had was this GPS thing. You remember the GPS thing you have in your vehicle, everyone? Tack, tack, tack. So I was kind of, for the next 500 meters, turn left. For the next exit, take the right exit. So I did it, I think, probably more of a dozen times. Turn right, turn left. Finally, I heard that sweet lady voice which you're familiar with. You have reached your destination. I was relieved. Now, why am I bringing this to you? It's not that I'm a sales agent for the GPS trackers. None of that. But something clicked my mind yesterday. Our tax auditors, our tax investigators, they have something common with a GPS tracker. Anyone have any idea? What is that? And I'm not going to answer today, not like yesterday. There's a reward for the one who answers it correctly. Any idea, Moksha?
Don't look at me because your questions is so tricky. I really want to try on that.
Okay. Since it's the beginning, because it's the beginning of the day, I will try to help you. Just like the GPS finds its destination, we'll always find a destination for you. Whether it's in the middle of the field, sugarcane field, in the sea, it will always tell you, you have reached your destination. And when you look around, it may not be your destination. Same thing happens to our tax auditors and tax investigators. They will always find the taxpayers. Wherever they are, from the corner of the island, anywhere. Yesterday we heard about digital communication. So we have all the means to track our taxpayers. But, more interestingly, our tax investigators have something more than the GPS. What is that? The GPS can only find the destination. Our tax auditor not only can track our taxpayers, but they can also follow the money where it's going on. So that was just food for thought, the start of the day. So Mokshada, let's do for real business now.
Well, as you were lost on your way back home, on my side, while driving back home, I was having a reflection, in fact, on all the hard work and dedication that one and all is making to make this event fruitful. Knowledge and experiences acquired through the conference will not only help us, but also our future generation. The continuous commitment from all of us certainly deserve a big round of applause to everybody. Well, coming back to business, today we have the honor of hearing from Dr. Esther Koisin, the Executive Director of CATA. Dr. Koisin will provide us a brief outcome of the General Assembly that we had yesterday. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join us in welcoming Dr. Esther to this stage. Thank you.
What is yours?
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the second day of the conference. Yesterday was incredibly productive, isn't it? Starting with a high-impact opening, graced by His Excellency, the President of Mauritius. This was followed by the keynote presentation on exploring the effective use of technology in tax administration and panel discussion on digital technology for tax compliance, the opportunities. And last night, we had an evening to remember with great food and fantastic entertainment. I hope that was recorded in all the dancing that you have joined in last night. And thank you to our wonderful hosts, the Mauritius Revenue Authority. You are awesome. Earlier in the afternoon, our CATA members convened to elect the president, chairman, members of the management committee, and the regional directors for the next 3 years. I would like to thank all members for their participation. The election process was smooth, and before I announce the new executive team and the management committee of CATA, I would like to share a thought that leadership is not about being in charge, it is about taking care of those in your charge. With this in mind, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the former president, chairman, and members of the management committee for their steadfast dedication and support for the past 3 years to the CATA Secretariat. Your contributions have been instrumental in advancing CATA's mission and agenda. Also to the regional directors, I hope some of you still remain as regional directors because you have done a very good job. Thank you for your consistent support. Your assistance has made the Secretariat work much easier. Together, we have ensured that we could deliver more for our members. It is now my privilege to announce the new executive members of CATA. First, the president position goes to Malaysia, represented by the CEO of Inland Revenue Board of Malaysia, Dr. Abu Tariq Jamaluddin. Congratulations. And we have a new chairman, none other than the big figure in tax administration, especially in the Mauritius Revenue Authority, Mr. Sudamo Lal, the Director General. Congratulations and thank you very much. And we have, of course, a new Vice Chair, Ms. Debbie Locke from the UK. Congratulations. And I would like to now announce the new management committee members from Canada, Barbados, Australia, Papua New Guinea, India, Malaysia, Maldives, Ghana, Nigeria, Lesotho, Malawi, Mauritius, and the UK. And for the regional directors, we have for Asian region, Maldives, and from Canada and Caribbean region, Canada, Europe region, UK, Pacific region, Australia, Northern African region, Rwanda, and Southern African region, Eswatini. So let's put our hands together to congratulate all of them. To the new President, Chairman, Vice Chairman, members of the Management Committee, and regional directors, I look forward to our close working relationship. Your exemplary leadership in your respective tax administrations will undoubtedly be a tremendous asset for CATA. I am confident that under your guidance and strong support, CATA will continue to grow stronger and achieve even greater success. Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday we launched our new website at the general meeting. I would like to take a minute before we proceed to the next agenda to show our new website to the rest of our members and all of you in attendance at this conference. Please do visit our website, which is still the same URL with a new look, and we have already uploaded what we have been doing for the last few days on the website. So, team, could you show it now? Am I supposed to click here? No. Please be patient. This is, very fresh from the oven. And this is live. You can see our event has been uploaded. Maybe just show the CATA technical conference, and we can close this. We will invite everyone to visit our website later. There is also a link to the more news on the conference, and it's a daily news update. To show our appreciation for the task force that work on the new website design, I would also like to acknowledge our former Vice Chair of CATA, who has stepped aside and has given the position to Ms. Debbie Locke to be Vice Chair of CATA, Mr. John Swadlow, who has been in the many years contributed so much to support CATA and for all the good work that he has done to CATA. This general meeting, he has stepped aside, and we have a new chair, vice chair from the UK. So I would like to acknowledge John by inviting him to present the certificates to our task force. Please, John. And please give a round of applause for John's good work for the many, many years to CATA. Thank you, John. And to receive the certificates, the task force comprises of Malaysia, led by Malaysia, and we have Mauritius and Barbados in the team. So I'd like to invite Zafir to represent the Malaysian team. And Mauritius, Mr. Subhash. And from Barbados, Caroline, please.
Thank you, Dr. Korisin, for bringing the highlights of yesterday's General Assembly meeting, and congratulations to the newly elected delegates and to countries. Ladies and gentlemen, we shall now explore a pivotal topic that sits at the intersection of two informative forces, globalization and digitalization, and the implications of tax administration. In our increasing interconnected world, globalization has shaped the way we conduct business. At the same time, digital technology is rapidly transforming every sector, including tax administration, as mentioned heavily in yesterday's topics and sessions. Together, these two forces present both significant challenges and remarkable opportunities. Kisnen, would you please share with us with whom we will be privileged for this discussion?
Yes, today we are honored to hear from Dr. Ashim Pros, Deputy Director, Center for Tax Policy and Administration, OECD, who will share his insights on these critical themes. Dr. Ashim Pros joined the OECD in 2001 and is currently the Deputy Director within the OECD's Center for Tax Policy and Administration. In this role, he has overall responsibility for a number of key outputs, including the Standard for Automatic Exchange of Financial Account Information in Tax Matters, the CRS. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's dive into this topic and welcome our first speaker for the day, Dr. Ashim Pros.
mic. Okay.
Tasha.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Does that work, Esther? Yes? Thumbs up? Thumbs up. Good. Now that's better. I can hear myself and there's a separate microphone. Esther told me yesterday, I'm not going to say everything Esther told me, probably. I'm supposed to be entertaining enough and insightful enough because you were all on the dance floor until 5 in the morning, so I'm supposed to wake you up. So I will eventually walk you around here. There will be questions for all of you. We do an exam at the end, and then we will all adopt the global minimum tax, and it's already in the communique. No. I think we have decided as a slight change of program that I think we discussed this with the panel, that the panel on the global minimum tax will take place in the pool. We make it a truly immersive experience. It's a Pillar 2 pool party, so we need to make this more entertaining and exciting. I hope, Esther, I'm doing okay so far. Yes, thank you. So maybe on a slightly more serious note, first of all, thank you to CATA, thank you to Mauritius, thank you to all the speakers, and thank you for having the opportunity to be here. I will try to stay in my 30 minutes. I usually fail, but I will try. And what I wanted to do is a couple of things. I mean, one is to give you a sense of the broader tax agenda, and it's our version. There's many tax agendas out there. I give you sort of the snapshot of what it looks like from where I stand. Then I want to talk to you about the pillars, but not so much to walk you through the difference between QRTC and all these other acronyms that we've created, but to tell you a bit the journey that countries came together and why they're doing it, and you are those countries for the most part that are doing this. And then I will focus on the global minimum tax, I think, because that's, I guess, a key part, and there's a panel that follows, hopefully in the pool. If it's not in the pool, it's in here. And then I think I'm trying to do something, and that's a special feature for you, Esther, where I'm trying to sort of have my personal thoughts on the debate OECD, UN. I will try to connect this to football and the importance of Esther. So you tell me whether that works. And then finally, I think I will try to connect, because that's the really important part, and that's also why I'm here, how this agenda connects to the agenda that you have in those 3 days that you're here. Less perhaps how it connects to the catamaran cruise on Friday, but at least to the rest of the program, I think. So with this, I think I wanted to give you a sense first of the broad agenda. Now, I bring up a slide. If I click this, I will bring up a slide eventually, right? So I'm clicking. I am clicking and it's working. This is CATA. You click and it works. You click too much, it goes too fast. That's a lot of text. It's a typical OECD slide. They come here, they tell you loads of things, right? So we'll make those slides available. But I think what I wanted to walk you through is, first of all, I think the broader agenda. Sometimes we focus on the pillar because that's our attention, but maybe that's not quite right. And so, you know, these are the various blocks of work that are on our agenda. And when I say our agenda, there's a very broad our here in some sense. There's some parts that are done by the OECD. There's other parts that are done by the Inclusive Framework. There's other parts done by the Global Forum, and these are driven by their members with consensus and are different organizations, even if mechanically and from a pay perspective, they're supported by people that are paid through the OECD's. They're hosted. But they, you have a representative of the Global Forum here, they respond to their members. They work for their members, and they are from their members, and there are 170 countries, there are 146 countries. And there's work that we're doing in the IFCMA. I think that's very important for a place like Mauritius. And I want to say a word about this. There's work that we're doing, a lot of it in Africa, together with UNDP, on tax inspectors without borders, where we can help individual cases and help those that need capacity to bring capacity at a case level in transfer pricing, but not just in transfer pricing, now also expanding it into the discussion on Pillar 2, and I'll cover that. And then there's the platform on collaboration of tax, just to give you a sense, where we bring together the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, and the OECD to focus on many of the issues that you have on your agenda over these 3 days here in beautiful Mauritius. And so that's first important. Yesterday, I had to step out, and some of you also had to step out, our friends from Nigeria and others, because we had a steering group of the inclusive framework. And that has, Nigeria on it, it has Zambia on it, it has South Africa on it, and many, many others that try to represent different regions and different interests that you try to bring into the process. It's co-chaired by Marlene Parker, who is sending her regards to Hank Williams, who was speaking at the same time as I had to step out, so you hope we apologize. And so maybe starting on the left, tax transparency, there's a big piece of work I think you will be discussing here on the effectiveness and automatic exchange to fight evasion, and that's a very important topic. It's a very important topic that is taking forward through the Global Forum and other bodies. And there's a whole list on this tax transparency, right? And this is helping you enforce the laws that you have by having the information to be able to administer your own laws. And there's more to come on this journey if we look ahead. This group is co-chaired by India, and it drives forward an ambitious agenda. There's more to come. We have the CRS. We're now moving into crypto, and there's crypto reporting so that when money leaves the traditional financial sector, it doesn't drop out of reporting, so we can assure that you still collect your taxes and it doesn't depend how a taxpayer holds its assets. Because it wouldn't make sense. We would empty out. We need to follow where the money is to have effective reporting to allow you to assure taxation and those trillions that sit outside your country and make sure that you can apply your rules to those so that not those that have the ability to put their money offshore pay less tax than those that cannot. And so that's an important debate that is also a debate allowing you to think about how you tax capital income. There was a time where you couldn't tax capital income because you didn't have the information. Now you do have the information, which also opens up a policy reflection at domestic level. What do you do with that? And then we're going to go further. People have told us, and thank you to our Indian friends who are also in the room under their presidency, that requested a report from the OECD on real estate and the exchange on real estate. And so we did that, and there was a follow-up under the Brazilian presidency to think about, are there aspects of evasion that can happen in the real estate sector? And I spoke to won't give the country, a French-speaking finance minister who told me that he actually was very interested not just in real estate as it relates to foreign real estate, but to having a proper property taxation system in his own country, so that he could think about property taxes of the wealthy in his own country that own property. And so when you think about the exchange, then it's also both an exchange dimension, but some people are also interested to use this as something that they can do domestically. There's a lot of work, I think, that we're still doing on beneficial ownership. Won't be able to talk about it, otherwise I go on for hours, and then Esther tells me it's enough. And then let me go to the next block. There's a big piece that we're doing here in Tax and Crimes, where we bring together, and I was very interested in the discussion yesterday on forensics and digital and how this works. We have a training academy that tries to bring together many of these investigators, whether they're tax investigators, whether they're financial investigators, whether they're prosecutors that track financial crime, whether it's tax or whether it's non-tax. And one of those, I guess, is also hosted by one of your members in Kenya. We've just renewed the MOU. There's an academy where we bring these together from Africa and other regions. And it's not the only academy. There's another academy in Argentina. There's an academy, a pilot in India. There's one in Tokyo, where we try to not change the rules, but allow everybody to better learn from the skills of others as you track down and as you work the cases. And to better understand, if you need information, where do you go in another country and how does this work? And we know that the tax crimes function sits in different places in different countries. Sometimes it's in the tax administration, that'd be the case of the IRS. Sometimes it sits with police. Sometimes it sits with the prosecutor's office. But all of these people, if they talk because they have a similar job, we all win. So that's a big part on fighting tax evasion, improving transparency, improving exchange, fighting illicit flows, also being practical about it, learning the skills, making it happen in the real world, not just writing big books about it. We also do that. We write a lot of big books. Then there's a bit in the middle here, and I think that's important. And that's, broadly speaking, the business taxation. It's not only, right? There's questions of tax treaties and transfer pricing. There's the OECD Model Convention. For the sake of completeness, of course, there's also a UN Model Convention. That's different, and that's good, because it gives you templates to choose from when you negotiate your treaties. There's the work on transfer pricing. There's the work on the pillars. I'm going to talk about the pillars, but there's also the BEPS that brought the 140 countries together in the first place. There's a big piece of work on tax certainty. Many dimensions of tax certainty, whether it's MAP, whether it's prevention, there's a lot of things that can be done to make the relationship easier with taxpayers. And easier doesn't mean your taxes go down. It doesn't mean your collection is the same. But there is also a question of trust, how you build this, which is when we started this, and in fact we started the pillar, sometimes referred to as the Pillar Zero, started it under the Chinese presidency. China that put that on the G20 agenda. And so there's a lot of work that we've done also with others when we think about tax certainty, because tax certainty for many businesses, and this is clearly shown in the work that we have done, is an element of stability. And the element of stability also sometimes allows to charge slightly higher rates, because people are sensitive to the fact whether this is a certain environment, and they put that into their investment decisions. And so tax certainty is also a dimension of investment and growth. And so that's, I think, we need to see it in that light. There's a very big part that we do on tax and the environment. There's a terrible acronym. I'm not going to try to talk you through it, but what we essentially try to do is that as we all move to net zero, because otherwise, you know, there's a lot of, we all know on why that objective is our objectives. People are moving at different speeds, and people are moving in different ways. And the idea of this IFCMA, in some sense, very simply, is try to create a common currency. So if country X does a particular policy and country Y does a particular policy, but X and Y are different, can we understand what the impact is of X, and can we understand what the impact is of Y, so we see where we're going, so we measure the effectiveness, not telling countries, you need to do this way or this, explicit or implicit carbon pricing or other things. But we try to understand what the effective, so we're all moving together, even if we take different paths towards a common goal. And then on the other side here, it's all the very important work that sometimes, when politicians come together, gets overlooked. The important work on tax administration. There's a UN report that tells us the tax administration can generate domestic revenue somewhere in the range of like 3% of GDP. Not of corporate income tax, but of GDP. So there's a very, very big piece on tax administration, and that's why, you know, I'm very pleased to be here, because that is the focus. And in some sense, that's very often also when you think about the money, where the money is. And within that, there's a big piece on consumption taxes. I'm not going to go through this, and there's a big piece on tax policy analysis. When we spoke to one delegate at the Inclusive Framework in terms of what he most needs, he says, well, what I really most need, ideally, is to be able to work with somebody to identify my priorities, because I don't have the data. I need to know what the data is, like, how are my tax gaps? Where is my biggest vulnerability, and where can I go? So there's a very big piece of making data available, which we do. There's statistics for Africa, there's statistics for Asia Pacific, there's statistics for the world. It starts with numbers. Now, this was a very long introduction. Before we get to what I'm supposed to do, but I think it's important to frame it, because this is a much wider agenda. Within this, we have the two pillars. Now, Esther, I took this picture in the fountain garden when we had the cocktail, and then, you know, I magically saw that in the fountain garden you had pillars, and inside these pillars were two pillars, right? Because two pillars is not enough, so have pillars inside the pillars. There's an amount A, there's an amount B, there's an STTR, and there's a global minimum tax. That's the two pillars. Now, what I wanted to do is walk you through just a little bit on, there's no way I'm going to walk you through all of these things, don't worry, but I'm happy to answer questions. I'm going to walk you through the journey, I think, because that's important. And that's in some sense resonating what you heard yesterday also on the introductions, including from the president that spoke to us. So there's a journey on the so-called amount A, and you don't need to look at all these points, because the journey is essentially that people have realized that there is something that doesn't quite work anymore. In this day and age, you can participate in an economy without being physically present. And that's a reality. Everybody that's not listening to me but is on the phone is showing that that is true. Yes, I see some of you. Stop. So, if we accept that, and I think everybody accepts that, then the question is, what do we do about that? It's probably true that when we created these rules, however the we was, and while I've been around, I was not around long enough in the 1920s, that probably at that point, if you wanted to do business in Mauritius, you needed to set up shop in Mauritius, otherwise you could not do business. It was just not possible. And so these rules evolved around the concepts that the people saw at the time, and they made sense. Which is also why some people see this discussion not necessarily as a reallocation of taxing rights, but as an updating of the architecture of our rules to bring it into 21st century, where those circumstances we see around us, certainly when we look in the phone, are very different from the circumstances we experienced in the 1920s. And so that's the basic challenge. And that brings a whole host of questions. When you say, this is what we do, then you'll have some people that say, oh, VAT is going to do this, right? Because essentially you're taxing consumption, so this is not a corporate income tax question. And if you go to Sweden, then that's what the Swedish people will tell you, certainly the representatives of the Ministry of Finance. And then we say, well, it can't be that this is just VAT, there needs to be a contribution from corporate income tax, right? And so we go on this journey, and this journey isn't a journey just about where exactly we are in the so-called multilateral convention. It's a much earlier journey. It's a journey where we start perhaps in 2015. There's an Action 1 report. And if you go in this Action 1 report, there's a section at the end that talks about approaches that countries are taking to this challenge of wanting to tax under an income, under direct tax concept, participation in my economy by foreign entities. Or maybe also taxing some of the profits that foreign entities make, even when they have a presence, but the present has very little profit, which is the result of the current rules. So it's both. It's nexus and it's profit allocation. So what do you do? So, there was a discussion, if you go back to 2015, we mentioned an equalization levy, we mentioned the withholding taxes, we even mentioned an SEP. There was no consensus on this, but you find these ideas. In 2018, we did an interim report. And at that point, you look at me, there was a short-term solution and a long-term solution. At that point, I was actually Mr. Short-term. Now, there was somebody else who was Mr. Long-term who has left the OECD, so I don't know what that tells you. But at least at that time, we also worked on an interim solution. And you know what happened to that interim solution, and that came out of this conversation. So what I'm trying to tell you, the important thing is also to be in this conversation and to think this through. And I remember looking over to India that when we did the Action 1 report, people were quite surprised what was coming out of this, and it resonated with many of the things that India was thinking, because India was around the table and India was bringing its thoughts into the process. And so the journey continues here. And so that's how you need to see it, I think, on that journey. We then take you forward from, the interim solution. We had an October statement, we have a progress report. There's many other things. And this is a complicated question. So sometimes we're getting criticized that we're not fast enough. Like, you've been working on this issue for 4 years and you still haven't done it. And sometimes we're getting criticized that we're working too fast. They say, this is far too complicated, I can't keep up with all these rules that you write. It's almost impossible, it's a dilemma, so I'm trying to get some sympathy from the crowd here, right? And then I think what was also interesting that some of I will not give the names, I'm not looking at the road, but some people were telling me, well, look, what you're trying to do here is you're trying to bring 140 countries together on changing some of the conceptual underpinnings of our architecture. And then you need to get a consensus, not in one country, but in 140, on something that's really complicated. And so, they say, look, we had a journey on VAT in my country, and that was only one country. It took us 20 years. You're doing pretty okay. You've added at 4 years, right? We could not even agree in one country on a change to the VAT. I'm not, but you need to see this in context. So we constantly try to be fast enough, but not too fast to take the community with us, but not to be too far ahead. Now, with this in mind, I think we now have a so-called multilateral convention that is very long. You've seen a consultation draft for those that follow, that amazingly is very stable. We have a very large degree, if not almost, yes, we're almost fully there on a text that everybody can live with. And that text is complicated. And I give you an example why this text is complicated. There is 140 countries, and if every single one of those countries has one issue that they care. So, let's say Esther feels very strongly about this particular rule, and India feels very strongly about another particular rule, and Nigeria feels very strongly about something else. Now, we can either ignore this and we have a simple version, or we can try to integrate this in this process that they feel they're part of the process. But if every one of the 140 countries only has one issue, I need to write 140 rules. If everyone has two issues that are very specific to that country. For instance, we had one country that wanted also very strongly felt about an extractives definition because there's an exclusion for extractives. So I can ignore this country at my peril, or I can try to work to get to a consensus. You get to 280 rules. So in some sense, if you do a consensus process, you know this from home, you get to a certain level of complexity. And now I need to speed up because otherwise, Esther tells me that's all terribly interesting, but we have no coffee break. So where are we? We are at a stage where there is, I guess, a G20 meeting also coming up. I'm not here, I'm here, where this will be on the agenda, where I think we are extremely close on the MLC text. There's a link to a certain amount B. I'm not going to go into the detail, which is really where most of the discussion is. What level of B comes with what level of A? And then largely also, it's a question where the key actor is the United States that also needs to see whether this is a package they can endorse or not, or whether it's still needed. So that's, I think, the status. What I'm trying to tell you is not walk you through all the provisions on the Pillar 1, but just give you an understanding of sort of the questions we're struggling with, some of the complexity that you come and you have when you try to get these different voices in the room and you try to hear them and you try to get to a consensus, which I think from a technical perspective, given where we have gotten to, I'm actually quite pleased. Now there's a question on the politics. Does the politics work? And it's always interesting. You go to some countries and say it's not enough money. And I had an interesting experience. Within 1 week, I was in Sweden and Kenya. They're equally dissatisfied. Now you can say, well, then it's a terrible solution. You can say, well, maybe it's not a bad solution. But I leave that with you. There's a journey on Amount B. And I'm not going to go through this in detail. Amount B is the simplification of transfer pricing for distribution activities, probably the most frequent activity that anybody encounters, because it's in practically every country. We will give you this slide, but the important part to take away, I think, on Amount B is this is something that I think was strongly pushed by many of our African members, because it's a very specific issue that we find in many of the developing countries. And why is that? No local comps, don't have access to expensive databases. Some taxpayer tells me I have a comparable and they say it's from Austria. What am I supposed to do with this, right? We have loss-making routine distribution over many, many years in some African countries, pointing to this would be consistent with OECD transfer pricing guidelines. We have complexity in the process, showing the numbers, comparing it, getting the data points, making the comparability adjustments, all of this. And B comes in, and if you're in scope, it essentially gives you a number. It's quantitative. It's something that many of the African members of the IAF strongly fought for and got, and it's now in the transfer pricing guidelines. It is available to all of you if you have that issue. We know that in some of our member countries, smaller developing countries, it can take out somewhere between, depending on the country, 30% and 70% of the cases that would otherwise go into the MAP and the dispute pipeline. That's a quite significant part. And it's also significant when you sort of discuss this at home, and I talk to some of you and you want to go to your finance minister and say we should do Amount B. Question is, how much money does that make? In some sense, it gives you simplicity. It will make money also because it removes these cases. It will significantly reduce the resource that you have to apply to these cases, so you can put it on something else. And under a certainty perspective, and that's also important for businesses from the investment attractiveness, it stabilizes and it might even result in more investment because it's much clearer how this will be dealt with. And I think in the design, we were able to put in adjustments to account for certain features that are specific in developing countries. And so there are adjustments baked into this. Happy to talk more about B. There is an STTR, a subject to tax rule, another thing I think that some of our African members, but not just those, but some of the other developing countries in the inclusive framework, and that's more than half of them, felt quite strongly about it. We had a first signing ceremony on the 19th of September. And it's sort of almost interesting that on the 19th of September, you had 19 countries signing. So now we're suggesting we should have signed on the 30th of September. We've gotten 30 countries, but luckily we didn't sign on the 1st of September. The important part here to take away, I think, is there is a discussion, and there's also a UN subject to tax rule. And some people are out there saying, oh, do this one, don't do this one. But I don't think you have to choose. They are different products. This STTR is fully ready-made. You have a right. All IF members have agreed that when you approach them as a developing country, they will give it to you. They will not negotiate about the terms. They will not say, but if I give you this, you need to give me something else. There is no ask in exchange. You have a right to ask. And when you ask, they have obligated themselves to agree to this STTR, either through a multilateral instrument, and this is what a number of those signed, or in a change to the bilateral treaty. And we have a documentation package that tells you as a developing country member of the IF, which treaties you can ask for it, what income it is in that treaty, and how much money it will give you when you do that. So you have all the information at your fingertips to then make the decision whether you do this. And then coming back to the UN subject to tax rule, but also exists, that's a different profile, it's a different product. It's broader, but you need to negotiate it. It's much more open, so it comes with a bilateral treaty process. So it's a different profile. This one, we sort of jokingly say, you get on Amazon Prime. You press a button, you get the STTR, almost. The other one gives you a wider application, but it will also take more time. And you need to negotiate the scope, to what it applies, whether it applies to individuals. So it's a different profile. And so I think that's how you should see about this. This is more complementary. And then let me go to the global minimum tax. I still have a couple of minutes, I hope. Yes. This is where we stand at the moment. Now, I was going to sort of do a question about, how many people in this room have the global minimum tax. I think I probably know the answer. And I would expect that many of the people in the room think about introducing a global minimum tax. I'm not going to do a show of hands. Esther, we can do that later to sort of see, whether that's something that's interesting. We do have, and this is changing almost daily, so, don't use this for external consumption. This is a snapshot, right? This may already be inaccurate as of this morning, right? And there's like numbers behind that sometimes change, and there's different stages. Somebody might have draft legislation, it's not yet enacted, it gets enacted. There may be framework legislation, but no regulation. So there's different aspects in this process as we all collectively reflect. Now, this is the part where I'm doing my commercial, so you need to discount what I say, right? Because I'm trying to say that you should really think about this, and I'm going to walk you through the aspects that I think matter. This is the first one. And this is perhaps the first question that your finance ministry might ask. Does this make any money? We come and we do tax policy and all the other things, but at the end of the day, you need to pay for schools and hospitals and other services, and you think about it, does this make money? Now, this is publicly available, this is not a new thing, but I think it's important to think about this. What happens here? This is the best estimates that we collectively have about the impact of profit shifting. And it's not difficult to understand. Much of the profit, when we look to aggregated CBCs, we find in investment hubs. And the taxation of that profit in the investment hub will go up. It will go up to 15%. And importantly, this is 15% effective. This is not 15% nominal. Because in many of the investment hubs today, it is not taxed at 12, taking a random number. It is not taxed at 10. It is taxed at 1 or 2 or 3 perhaps, because we're looking at the effective rate. So if the effective rate goes up to 15 in some of those investment hubs where you may have shifted the profit largely for tax reasons, that over time gets less attractive. So the business person at the head of the company is saying, well, some of that money maybe doesn't go there, it goes where the market is. And so this, I think, is showing the change in where the money goes in terms of the location as a result of different profits, of the reduction in profit shifting. And you see those numbers, and you also see that low income and lower middle income jurisdictions get the greatest percentage in the increase. It's a percentage. So if you did this in absolute numbers, of course, it's not as much as in a larger economy. But if you do it in relative terms, the size of your economy, the biggest impact, relatively speaking, as you can see here, is in lower middle income countries. So that's, I think, the first point to remember. So the money is going to shift to some degree. And it is going to come to many of you as a result of the profit shifting. In some sense, you don't need to do anything. That happens just because there is a minimum tax. And if you think about it, the minimum tax today already applies to about 60% of all the in-scope groups above 750. And by the end of next year, it should be at 90%. So you already have that coverage, right? So that's one. Then I think some people say, well, it's 15, okay, but in Africa and other places, my tax rate's 25%. So people will still continue to profit shift, like it doesn't change anything. And we say that's not true, and that's not true for, I guess, 3 reasons. One is that the hubs, as I said, are at much lower today, and it will be higher tomorrow. And so the rate goes up. Also, the research shows that profit shifting needs a substantial rate differential to pay. You're not going to shift the profit if you have a tax rate differential of 5 or 6 or 7. You need more. And it's in that more area that we see the reduction, and all the research and all the academic research and all the experience shows that. And finally, and this is what this number shows, many of you are actually not at 25 effective rates. This is the dispersion of all countries in terms of their actual effective rate. And you see that middle and low income countries account for almost 30% of all profits currently taxed below 15%. So there's significant pockets of low tax money in your jurisdictions. And why is that? Well, in part it's because MNEs can come to you and say, well, if you don't give me a certain tax incentive, I'm going to give to your neighbor. And then you drive it down. We see tax incentives, and I think that's also going to come on the panel, where even in one country, one tax incentive competes with another tax incentive. And so I think it opens up that conversation on tax incentives, thinking through what you might be able to do without telling you what you're supposed to do. So in this context, I think we think that one way to think about it and one way to approach this is to actually introduce the global minimum tax. And when we think about this, I think there's a couple of relevant considerations I'm going to walk you through. I think the World Bank has a paper out there that says, do a QDMTT, then think about, the wider questions. There's many countries, a number of countries, that don't even account for their tax expenditure. They don't necessarily know what they're giving away. They know the money they make, but they don't necessarily know the money they could be making if there weren't these tax expenditures. Some of them have been around for a very long time, even sometimes for industries that don't even exist anymore that have been adapted. Sometimes one minister gives one incentive, another minister gives another incentive. So I think there is a question where also I think many others, and we were talking about it yesterday, have a very important role to play. Just think through that question and then come to conclusions, whatever they might be, but it's an opportunity to rethink. From an MNE's perspective, it actually doesn't make a difference whether you do a QD-MTT or not if the MNE is in scope of Pillar 2. Why is that? Because for them it's only a question, do I pay Mr. Dan? Do I pay the UK? Or do I pay the local country? But the amount you pay is the same. So the M&E is actually indifferent. So from an investment perspective, whether you do a QDMTT or not, for an in-scope M&E makes no difference for the M&E, and that's the change in the environment. So against the backdrop of that change in the environment, you need to think about, do I want to take this money or do I not? Because it now opens an opportunity, and while you might be thinking, well, if I do it but my neighbor doesn't do it, I'm uncompetitive, in some sense that's no longer the case. Because wherever they go, whether they go to your neighbor or they go to you, whether you have a QDMTT or not, they pay the same amount of money, they just pay it in the residence jurisdiction. So I think it changes the reflection a bit how we need to think about this. In terms of the money, we can work with you as the Secretariat of the Inclusive Framework, and we have done this, in terms of how much this raises. We can help you find out what the population is that you might have in scope. And we can also help you, I think about how you can design the rules. For instance, I'm looking at Barbados. I think we've worked very closely with the Secretariat. Thank you much for the good cooperation in working through these difficult questions also for some of the smaller island states. In terms of how do you do this in the environment, how can you make it work for your country and also be a winner in this, like all of us, and not specifically one country versus another. And I think that's a good example of working closely together with the Secretariat as we think about the legislation, the different approaches, and then taking you through the process. And it's not over, but I think we're at a much better place, so thanks a lot. Then some people say, oh, but if I introduce the global minimum tax, I can't do tax incentives. I'm a developing country, what do I do? And we say that's also not true. It's not true because there's a substance carve-out. Many of the, I guess, headquarter jurisdictions didn't actually want to do a substance carve-out. It was the developing countries in the inclusive framework that very strongly insisted on the point that we want to have a policy space that is specific to our incentives. And our incentives, I remember somebody, I'm not giving you an African delegate, that said in a meeting, we don't care so much about R&D incentives because that's a rich man's incentive. We care about substance-based incentive. We want to employ people. We want to have assets and factories because that is us. And that is why they insisted, and it's in the design, there is a substance-based income inclusion where you do what you want in some sense with a return on assets and labor. So if you now think about this, there's a lot of things that still can be done, but maybe, and that's certainly what the academic literature suggests, they're more targeted. They're not flat tax holidays where you just pay zero and doesn't matter what you do. You actually need to do something in the country. You need to hire people, you need to build plants, you need to build factories, and the more you do this, effectively the policy space is there for you to decide not to tax it. And it's only when you get to the excess profits that we're back. And if you do a QDMTT and you go into these excess profits, you're gonna hold on to the money. And there's many other things where there's now a very active discussion, not just with us, but with the IMF, with the World Bank, I think with ATAF, with many of the regional organizations to rethink incentives, not to get rid of incentives, but to make them specific to the people, the factories, what you are seeking to achieve. You can do, for instance, also immediate expensing. And that actually generates business, and there's nothing to do because if you're just shifting from one period to another, you never get in the minimum tax because that's the way it's designed. So very happy to have a wider conversation. Then what's required for adoption? One, you need to understand the rules. And let me just personally speak. I find, sometimes we go to these conferences and somebody tells me, oh, the global minimum tax is too complicated for developing countries. And I don't buy this. I find this patronizing. Because understanding the rules is a complicated endeavor, but you can work through these rules, and we've seen it in inclusive framework just as much, Mr. Dan. Because it's complicated, but it needs to be complicated because we're actually taxing the largest M&Es in the world. But while, it's complicated, it doesn't mean it's too complicated for any particular country. We recognize that the challenge is the capacity of having many of these people, but you don't actually need many of these people given the size of the M&E concentration in your country. You need 1, 2 people, and you have them. And I have seen it in the IF every single time where some of the delegates from the so-called developing world intellectually can run ring-arounds from the so-called developed world. So that's just not true. It's not too complicated to understand. We've also done implementation handbooks, trainings assistance. You need to understand the impact assessment. We can help. We have economists who can model to help with you to understand how much money this makes for your country, and also to understand how big the population is, and these questions are linked. Legislation is a challenge, and we're trying to simplify it also so that when you go to your minister doesn't say, what the hell is these 100 pages? That's a real challenge. I understand that we're on it. And then there's administration. And on the administration, maybe just a word, and this will take you to Victor in a moment. It's his hometown, I think. So, we have a kickoff meeting on the 31st of October. It's hosted by the Netherlands, and what does this do? It brings together 70 plus tax administration from all the countries that have either implemented the global minimum tax, or that are thinking about it, or are affected by it. And that means we bring them together so they can learn from each other as they implement the rules and they think about the implementation of the rules. And that matters because we all start afresh. Taxpayers are building systems. We can leverage of those systems for Pillar 2 compliance, right? We can think that through together. Some of you in this room might have solved a challenge of how you onboard these taxpayers. Well, if one of you has solved it, maybe that solution, if you just share it, every one of you can do. Some of you have figured out how you do risk assessment on those returns that come in. And because you have the same rules and you get the same global information return at the same time, you can think through, maybe I can do this too. If somebody in this room has a good idea about Pillar 2, it probably applies to every one of you. And that's what we're trying to do, so we take the complexity out, or at least reduce it, at the level of the tax administration. It's important to see this as a kickoff meeting if you're not there, and many of you are there, but if you're not there, this is a journey that will continue. So this is open to IF members. We even have some non-IF members that have an interest from Africa and other places. We also have the support, I think, of the IBFD who will be speaking, the World Bank, the IMF. They're also thinking about helping you with travel costs. We have Esther there, CATA will be present. So I think about this. When we work together to think through the administration of this, we can significantly reduce the complexity and learn from everything that anybody else has already thought, because now we have the same rules. We have the same information at the same time. That has a massive potential of us collectively moving forward. Now, I got 5 more minutes. 2, 1, 2. This is my special Esther feature, so I keep the best for the end. We're moving away from the global minimum tax, and when you open the papers, you see very often in the tax press, OECD versus UN. And I have to talk about this, right? And the important message I want to leave with you today, as I move into the end of my presentation, it's not a football match. That's what the press would like. I very often on the stage with the UN Secretariat and myself, and they put us up and we're so meant to wear this sort of blue jersey and the red jersey, and then we meant to sort of do battle because that's what journalists expect us to do, and then we don't. And they're terribly disappointed because that's how this whole conversation is framed. But it's not true. It's not true because we actually work well together. We have joint training on dispute resolution. We go to their meetings, they go to our meetings. There's a lot of cooperation. There's an OECD model, there's a UN model. And even when you think more widely, and this links to your agenda, there's many taxes that matter to you, but sometimes these taxes aren't even CIT, and we never talk about it. 50, 60% of revenues in many developing countries actually come from VAT. Who makes the VAT rules? All of us. We do some, Brussels does some, you do some, a lot of people do them. It's a bit sort of this image that I could be sitting there with my friends in Paris coming up with the rules of the world, but we don't. Tax administration, 3% of GDP. Who makes the rules? Esther does. CATA does. Many other people do. So I think that we see it, we shouldn't fall into the trap of us being put into boxes of two camps that then do battle because that's a good story for the press, because it's not the reality. So what we actually need, Esther, that's your special, we need this. This is the picture we should have in mind. Team Esther. And you see the guy with very little hair, that's me. Now, don't quote this because I'm sure I've forgotten somebody, and somebody will be upset because they're not in the team. We did this yesterday evening, which is why I left the cocktail a bit early. It's just giving you a sense. There's so many issues out there, so many questions and so many tax areas, which is what the first slide is trying to show, that rather than having this press nice battle and there will be one winner and at the end somebody walks off and will set the rules for all of you, it's not real and it's not what we should be striving towards. And there's many of these aspects in many of these things where all of those players need to come together in their respective regions and make their contribution to you. Because ultimately, it's the country that decides. It's not the OECD that decides. It's not the UN that decides. It's your parliaments that need to be persuaded to decide, because otherwise nothing actually happens. Now, that's, I think, a picture that at least local people know, and I think that's also very fundamental. Like in this journey, we see that people run to certain solutions that are solutions to problems that they sometimes don't have. We see people arguing about treaty provisions from countries that don't have treaties. So I think it's very important that we all don't get defined by where we grew up and what we look, but what is the profile of my country? What are my priorities? Do I have extractives? Do I not have extractives? Am I a big market? Am I a small market? Am I an island country? Am I an island jurisdiction? How do I cope with the situation? What do I do for a lack of tourism? How do I develop? How do I keep my people? And you may be coming to different questions. So we strongly don't like being put into boxes, whatever those boxes are. It's quite attractive because it makes a simple conversation. You can sell a newspaper, but it's not us. And that's why I finish some of those conversations that you're having today, and I really finish now because I'm way too late, can be driven by, for instance, tax to GDP ratios. Like that's a useful metric to think about it. And there's a lot that we can do. If the question is domestic resource mobilization and the money, that's a good place to start. And in this conversation, I think there's a lot that can be done and then can be reflected and learned. And if we start with, for instance, tax to GDP, if the question is the money, and there may be other questions, but different, but what is your question? And then the answer, rather than we come up with an answer and then try to figure out what the question was. Tax to GDP is a good place to start. I'm not going to go through in the individual ones, and if you're in this, the work that you're doing, I think, over the course of the day, for instance, on VAT tax gaps, is tremendously important. And maybe also some of these requires the necessary focus that it sometimes doesn't have, because if the question is, where does the money come from? The answer isn't necessarily always CIT. It may be some other taxes that maybe need to put in the spotlight, where there's a lot of learning and technology can do a lot. I think Kehinde, you will be giving a presentation on some of the electronic applications we can do, and that can make real money for those that also think about the money. I've gone way too long, but at least I wanted to show you Team Esther. I'm still here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ashim Prost, for bringing this valuable knowledge regarding the ongoing work under Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, as well as the broader implications of globalization and digitalization for tax administration. Now, that's when we are going to talk on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. I think we are going to think about that fountain garden first. So thank you for that memory, Dr. Ashim Prost.
Yes, thank you. So now, Mokshada, we have reached session 2 of our conference today, where we're going to delve into a topic that is equally increasingly relevant in today's complex global economic landscape, understanding the global minimum tax.
Indeed, Kisnen, as we navigate the challenges posed by globalization and digitalization, the introduction of global minimum tax represents a significant step towards achieving a fairer and more equitable tax system. Ladies and gentlemen, to lead this interesting session, our moderator shall be none other than Dr. Esther Koisin, Executive Director of the CATA. Let's welcome our moderator to the stage and embark on this enlightening journey into the world of the global minimum tax. We are also going to welcome our first panelist, Mr. Dan Jennison. Our second panelist, Professor Dr. Victor Van Comer. And our third panelist, Mr. Chris Sanger. So now I'll leave the floor to you, Dr. Esther.
Keep that with you.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to speak after Dr. Akim Pros. Not just about the topic itself, but the speed at how he gives so much of information in a very short time. So I try to speak as fast as possible as well, because we only have 60 minutes and we want to ensure that we will not deprive you for your lunch at the right time, as well as to hold you longer than necessary today. Today you have the evening free, so you may have made arrangements. So, and my problem here is I have these three panelists who has such an expansive experience that to introduce them would be very, very difficult in a very, very short time. But however, I will try my best not to do injustice to your credentials. So welcome once again to all of you who are still very much interested to listen to this session. I see no one has left, but you are free to go to for a little bit of refreshing yourself at the washroom if you would like to. But please do come back. Thank you very much for joining us today for this crucial discussion. And I'm sure all of you are Team Esther. They have no choice. They are definitely Team Esther. And Akim, definitely I am Team Akim. So yes, our discussion is very important, the crucial discussion on the implementation challenges of the two-pillar solution in addressing tax challenges arising from digitalization of the global economy. I'm very honored to moderate this session, and as Akim has informed everyone, global economy becomes increasingly digitalized and traditional tax systems face significant challenges. So today, ensuring that multinational enterprises pay a fair share of tax wherever they operate. A lot of tax administration has already started implementing the global minimum tax, and some are still in different stages. So our today discussion, despite the broad agreement on these principles, on the principles and implementation of these pillars, do present several challenges. This includes aligning domestic tax laws with international standards, addressing the administrative complexities, and managing the diverse economic impact across different jurisdictions. So we will delve into the challenges of implementing the global minimum tax, share insights from various stakeholders that have committed to implement the global minimum tax. For CATA, we are looking into how we could support our members in understanding the pillars and addressing challenges that arise at each phase of the implementation stages. This session is crucial not only for delegates seeking to learn from experience of other tax administrations and gain insights from business perspective and international organizations, but also for CATA Secretariat. It will help us better position ourselves to take forward the issues and recommendations from this discussion in our capacity building program. So like I said, we have very limited time to discuss such an interesting but complex topics. I'm not sure whether I'm allowed to say complex, because just now Akim said nothing is complex, too complex that we can't make ourselves understand it. So definitely, I'm going to try to change my perspective now. It's not complex at all. We will be able to dive into it. So we are privileged to have 3 distinguished panelists with us, each bringing unique perspective in our discussion. First, we have Dan Jennison from HMRC, who will provide insights from the perspective of tax administration. Dan is the Deputy Director of Large Business Compliance at HMRC UK. He has led HMRC's operational response to OECD pillars, designing and implementing compliance strategies, and overseeing international tax dispute. Next, representing, I hope, not just the business, but also probably government perspective as well. We have Chris Sanger from EY. Chris is the Global Tax Leader for Government and EY Tax Policy Leader for the UK. He has extensive experience advising governments worldwide and has held significant roles, including Head of Business Tax Policy at His Majesty Treasury, HM Treasury of the UK in his previous role. Finally, offering the viewpoint of international organization, we have Professor Dr. Victor Van Kommer from IBFD. Victor is the Director of IBFD Capacity Building and Tailored Service Knowledge Center, and a member of the IBFD Executive Board. He has a rich background in tax administration, having worked with the Netherlands Ministry of Finance and published several influential books on tax systems. I hope by briefly introducing all three of them and highlighting a few of their expansive experiences, I am not doing injustice to their credentials. Let's give them a warm welcome for this panel session. So before we begin the panel session, I would like to outline how we will proceed. This is not just for your information, but also to guide and keep them on check as well. Each of our panelists will start with a brief presentation. I've calculated in minutes, so Debbie, please help me to check their time, because I don't want everybody to sit there fidgeting that, oh, when they're going to finish, it's they've eaten up some of the time. So yes. So before we begin, I would like to outline. So just a minute, I'm taking. Okay, so each panelist will start with a brief presentation, followed by a panel session, okay, where we will discuss more in depth on the topic, and finally we will open the floor. So if the presentation given to you is 7 minutes, and if you're taking more than 7 minutes, your panel questions may be taken away from you. So you have 7 minutes for the presentation, short presentation for the first round, and we are supposed to have 2 panel questions for each of you. So that's the guide. So then, from the perspective of the tax administration, could you start, please? Thank you.
Good morning, good morning. Thank you, Esther. I understand the rules of engagement now, so hopefully I can follow the time limit given to us here. Yeah, good morning. I'm Dan Jennison. Keeping with the theme of the Pillar 2 pool party, I think I am the DJ as Dan Jennison, so I think that's why I'm here. I'm also here, as Esther mentioned, that I have overseen the implementation of HMRC's operational response to Pillar 2. I have learned a lot in the process, and I'm going to share some of that with you today. I hope that will be helpful, as either some of you may be implementing now, or having heard the presentation and sales pitch earlier, I think we'll shortly be considering implementation shortly. Additionally, I think the things that I'll discuss as well will have relevance to implementing new tax measures from a tax authority's perspective. So let's start with the context on the UK implementation. The UK has introduced legislation. We are living in the first accounting period for Pillar 2 in the UK currently. Some of the more significant considerations from a legislative point of view were administration, and as noted on the slide, what was key was ensuring consistency between Pillar 2 rules, but also UK legislation more generally and admin issues seen elsewhere. The UK has published guidance in relation to explain the UK legislation, and with both legislation and guidance, we have sought the viewpoint of externals having consultations on both. Before I move to the next slide, I just wanted to mention that different jurisdictions will take different approaches. There is obviously flexibility built in here. Some jurisdictions have decided to introduce a top-up tax as part of their corporate income tax regime, whereas in the UK, we have introduced it as a separate set of taxes. We'll all be aware as tax authorities will have existing processes, strategies, and other legacy IT systems. And then when introducing new measures, we often have to consider the impacts of those and modifications. Therefore, for Pillar 2, although there will be unique challenges, I hope what I go on to on the next slide, there will be similar themes that's hopefully be relevant to all of you. Next slide. I've done it. Excellent. We have the next slide. I mean, I don't need to give too much context on Pillar 2, as you probably all have some awareness of that, and obviously heard a lot today. It is a new developing area, and it's new to tax authorities, it's new to businesses, it's new to advisors and other industry bodies. What was key was in HMRC, we set up a transformation program to manage the implementation. This created structure around our plans and considering impacts across the organisation, thinking about customer service, compliance, debt management, and even such things as finance and HR. It has helped to recognise the importance of the programme within the organisation at a senior level and ensuring that the work is appropriately prioritised. It was key early on to assess our impacts and identify the population impacted by Pillar 2. We utilised a mix of public data sources and data available to HMRC to identify this, and as you would expect, country-by-country reporting was a good place to start, but some adjustments required. We currently estimate that about 4,100 of the largest businesses based in the UK are in scope of Pillar 2. We're able to divide this population up to different sectors, size, and also such things as where the ultimate parent location is. And I think maybe if there's time for panel questions later, if I'm going on time, I'll perhaps explain a little bit more about why this has become important and how we are tending to as well tailor our approaches across the population. The other point which I wanted to mention, which was the third one, all the hands coming together, the dedicated Pillar 2 compliance team. We decided early on that we were not going to make every tax specialist a Pillar 2 specialist. It would not be efficient, it would be resource intensive and a major resource spend. And perhaps similar to what you heard a moment ago, is that having that smaller number of specialists would be the most efficient way and minimise risk of delivery on other international and domestic tax compliance issues. And we have this central team who oversees this implementation, but works with the rest of the organisation. It's been key, moving on to training, one down from there. But clearly these are a new set of rules. There may be some complexity, but obviously with specialisms in the organisation, it's working well. It is different to our existing company tax rules in many places. And we have set up this team early, building their capability early, anticipating some lead time to get them fully up to speed as to where we want them. We've had a lack of existing training material because it's new, so we've been developing our own material as well as we go, updating as further administration guidance has come out and new legislation published as well. I think that in terms of training, I'll just mention clearly it's not just new tax rules here. There are a lot of accounting concepts that perhaps we wouldn't ordinarily be considering from tax authorities' perspective, so we've had to invest early in some accounting knowledge as well. The final thing which I'm going to mention, final, hopefully keeping to my 7 minutes, is the IT. We are building a new IT service for Pillar 2. We needed to decide how we were going to do that and decided that we needed to do a sequencing of work which would have different releases when customers, advisors needed them, subject to those statutory deadlines in the legislation. We've already launched our registration service, and our next release on payments and agent services is due to be released shortly. What has been key as part of the IT build has been having the people with the tax technical knowledge working closely with the IT developers, systems, and design architects to ensure that it will meet HMRC's and our customers' requirements to fulfill their Pillar 2 obligations. That's all I was going to cover for the moment, but I think I might come back to a few of the other points on this slide later, allowing time for our other panelists to introduce their areas. So thank you. Speak soon.
Yes, no time to waste. Chris, the implementation of the GMT requires business to make necessary preparations. So Chris, as tax advisor, could you share with us how multinational enterprises should or are preparing for the GMT implementation? Over to you. 7 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure to be here. I did check, by the way, that there's no trap door here that was going to open up after 7 minutes. And I have put 7 minutes on my watch. So if you see my watch, my arm vibrate, you'll know that I've gone over time. But I am endeavoring to make sure that I am actually on time. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. As Dr. Esther said, I come here with the knowledge and the experience of some of the things that we've seen from the businesses that we've spoken to around the world in helping them to try and do their journey to getting their systems ready and fit for implementing all the rules that are necessary for Pillar 2. But also come from a number of discussions with a number of you in the room about actually your systems, and also helping some governments work through the kind of nature, some of the things Dan just spoke about, in terms of building the right systems, building the things in place in order to be able to understand how you're going to cope with what is ostensibly, originally was intended to be one new tax. This was meant to be an overlay, a global minimum tax across the piece, but in practice has become a plethora of domestic minimum taxes that are very similar but also quite different. And I think it's important to think about those kind of things when you're thinking about what the multinational is having to do. So anyway, thank you very much again for the opportunity to be here, both from CATA, from the MRA for hosting us, and of course for the entertainment we've had over the last 2 nights. If I go to this first slide, I think it did have some words on it, but those seems to be lost. What this picture is not meant to be trying to imply that the global minimum tax is going down a river at high speed and potentially out of control. That's not the message I'm trying to say. This is actually one of the images from our survey that just came out earlier this month. So you're getting it right at the moment. This was a survey of over 1,100 tax functions of the largest multinationals and over 500 finance functions. Available online if you want it. And it was all set in June and July this year. And one of the key questions in there is the one that you can't read at the bottom, which basically says that 83% of those businesses concluded they needed to make moderate or significant adjustments to source data to develop tax-ready information to comply with this Pillar 2, the global minimum tax. 83%. That's a huge number of companies who are saying they've got a large amount of work to do as a result in order to be ready for this. So there's a lot of focus being done on this and a real need as we get through. This is a really good slide if you could actually see it. All right, so I will tell you what's in the boxes. I'm tempted to ask questions for this, but okay. So let me tell you, what I have here, it's lucky I have a copy here, I could show you later. So basically, what I was about to say, if it looks complex, then that's because it is. Well, here it looks lots of blank boxes, so that's fine. But basically, if we think about what the multinationals have to do on their journey, when you see the eventual slides, you'll see that it's split into kind of 4 key sections. There's the assess section, which is all about what's happening right now. It's doing that tax technical analysis to identify what is actually needed in all the countries around the globe. That also includes doing the modeling and trying to work out actually how much tax is there to pay. And of course, that's got to take into account every single domestic minimum tax as well. The second part of that is the CBCR process review. A lot of this and a lot of the factors that actually relate to the safe harbor, the transitional CBCR safe harbor, relies on the CBCR data, that country-by-country data. The next one is, and the one that is most critical, is data readiness. It's very easy to think that a multinational can press a button and get this data, but it can't. If you're a multinational that's done recent mergers, you've probably got completely different systems. And we think about the financial reports that come out every year. And it's actually really good that the whole of this is based on financial accounting, because that's really important. But I like to think of the financial accounting a bit like a sausage. Yeah? It's nice when you've got it all together, but you do not want to see how it's made. And in order to do Pillar 2, you've got to see how it's made. You've got to be able to get into the detail and do that. And that's the real challenge that the multinationals are going through today. And what they're now trying to do as well is to work out what resources they need to do that. So that's your assess stage. That's where the multinationals are today. We've then got the next stage, which is the preparation stage. That's preparing not for that first filing, which as we all know is in 2026 or the 2024 start, but for that interim report that you've got to give to the market. We know the UK rules are active already. If you're a UK multinational, you may have to be reporting on a quarterly or half-yearly basis as to what is the impact of these taxes. That means that's affecting you now. You're having to know that data now. You might say that it's not a material sum, but you've got to be able to justify that. So there's a huge amount of work that is happening by those multinationals right now. And then the last part of this, the stage 3, where you can't see under the operate for long-term compliance, is all about doing the things that Akim was talking about before, about building those systems to be able to deliver what is necessary in order to be able to get those data to the right places and to be able to fill in the forms and fill in those reports that are needed for all of you to get that data. And that's, again, another real challenge. But we heard yesterday about the power of technology. That's what we're beginning to see, the use of AI and others to try and help make that a bit easier. I'm going to go to the next slide with a little bit of trepidation. Well, at least it's consistent. Okay, what this was meant to show was the time chart, and if you look at the last one, was going through the 4 different stages. Well, this one was meant to show you, and I guess if you look at the things you can see, that we've got and I know I'm over time, but you've got the TCSH, the Transitional CBCR Safe Harbor. That is critical for many multinationals in terms of timing, and therefore we're going to see a big input when we get to the kind of 2026 and beyond when that goes away. But lots of multinationals are worried about that safe harbor because actually it could be relatively easy to fall out. So when we think about those things, they've got some real challenges. Now, my final slide, do you think we'll be lucky on this one? What do we think? Well, okay, it's 0 for 0 on this one. Okay, what this was meant to show you were the 10 stages that are needed for a multinational to go through in order to be able to identify basically what it needs to put in its interim reports. Number 1 is to work out whether it's in scope in the first place. Relatively easy, you would think. The next bit is to do that technical review. Then you've got to work out whether your CBCR is fit for purpose. Then you examine your tax accounting records, because of course this is all based on financial accounts. Next, you check whether that TCSH safe harbor is available. Then if not, you've got to gather all those data. You've got to run your globe calculations. You've got to consider any uncertain tax positions. And then you've got to think about what are you doing and what are you going to put in your financial disclosures. And you think you're done? No. Then you've got to convince your auditor that all of those things are done. And all of that has to be done now. So the multinationals that are in your countries are going through all of this. To Akin's point, and my last one, and I will now sit down as I've gone through my 7 minutes. To Akin's point, the multinationals are engaging. They're trying to work this out. They should be able to help you understand what they're doing. If you haven't had that discussion with them, they should be able to talk to you. They should be able to give you that level of insight. This is a wholly new tax, and we are all going through this together. Thank you.
Okay, no time to waste. Professor Dr. Victor Van Komen, from an international organization perspective, could you share your thoughts on the implementation challenges of the GMT? Specifically, could you discuss the choices available to jurisdictions with different economic and tax administrative characteristics?
Yeah, you know my reputation. It can take longer. First of all, I think your slides were marvelous. You can use them for every conference. That is he will pay me back later. Something else, Achim also invited us to join the pool. This morning, I was in the pool. There are two pools. You was in the other pool, but we haven't seen anyone. But neither we haven't seen Achim there. But maybe for the afternoon, late afternoon. I will say a few things, because only 7 minutes. First of all, is also IBSD position. We are part of Esther's team already for a long time. And sometimes in a kind of hybrid position, sometimes we're talking with you, sometimes we're bringing the water and the towels to the field. But we are part of this international tax community. And I think Arvin made it very clear, there are not many differences. But why, and I'm also talking here from my own experience, why this is this global minimum taxation such a game changer. For me, or for IBFD as well, it is a wake-up call to redesign your tax incentives. I would have said that also without a GMT, because it is needed. Because it is like sugar, we are addicted to it. Many developing countries, but also developed countries, and it is most of the time even not helpful. What is also nice, because also studying income tax systems over decades, income tax systems came out of the 19th century and has a significant correlation with the kind of societies we have built, also our democratic systems. And thus we always has organized our taxes on a domestic way. You can even say, was international taxation existing? It is the same like flying. You have to land always in a jurisdiction. For the first time, we create something now on top of it. And we at IBFD, we are also known for our databases. We have even to reorganize our databases. In that sense, there is now a layer on top of it, not starting from the domestic view, and what I say here, knitting together with difficult treaties and interpretations, PE provisions, etc. There's something else coming in. Next to the rules, a lot of conferences, of course, rule-based about GMT, Pillar 1, Pillar 2. We have to focus also on about the implementation. The last thing I want to say, and that is always a concern I have, when we talk about Pillar 2, the 15%, we have to keep in mind that below, it is always kind of pyramid, there are still taxpayers in many jurisdictions paying now already more than 50% effective tax rate. Thus we have to consider that part as well. Sometimes I will skip some slides. But this one is the typology of tax incentives, just 4 categories. And also when I analyzing our own tax research platform of IBFD, then we see all kinds of incentives on all these 4 categories. When it's about natural resources, tax incentives not making any difference for the investment. Of course, they want to have it, the investors, but it's not making any difference because they come for your raw materials. It is also about the market seeking FDI. It is also for strategic asset seeking that tax incentives are not always so relevant. At the bottom, you see it, efficiency seeking investments. But that is most of the time also volatile investments. They go easily from one country to another. We see it now in the Asian market. Also, China is seeing that a part of the industry is moving out to Vietnam, and that is the low part of the economy. That's also with low labor cost. When you look in the textile industry in Vietnam or in Bangladesh, it is very easy to set up such a factory, some machinery, and you can really remove such an investment in a couple of days or a week and you move to another country. The question is that the kind of investment you want to have? Just an overview of the tax incentives, also based on analysis. Achim mentioned already, it is, what I said, it is an addiction. And I've done it recently for another country, not a part here, that many tax incentives are competing with each other. Even tax incentives launched, sometimes even this year in May, and for countries who are really considering to be part of the GMT. This one is just, and you will see the slides later, then you have also some nice materials to take home. Here you see a list of the tax benefits affected by the GLOBE rules. And then you see that most of these tax incentives will have an impact. And here you see how the tax incentives are categorized. Dus again, it is a kind of early warning for you, be careful in this aspect. I will skip these slides. But what has to be done? Also for countries sitting here, you need to have a strategic plan from how to deal with your tax and non-tax incentives in the light of Pillar 2. And again, for me, that's an open invitation, game changer, you have to do it anyway. Of course, that can be more challenging for many of you, especially if you are addicted to these tax incentives. And I have seen a lot of studies about tax incentives that they are finally in favor of your country. But most of the time, these studies were done in isolation, not with the perspective of Pillar 2, because then we have a more same level playing field. And there is always benefits from it. But you have to ask yourself, when you're not giving these benefits, probably this investment would have come to your country anyway. I'm more part of the hard school to be very careful with tax incentives. And what is also important, that you have a kind of mechanism also to calculate it, to see what is the impact, how it costs for your revenues, your treasury, and is that bringing really the economic gains you have in mind. People also say there is a lot of literature at this moment about it, that the less developing countries has, of course, not the money at this moment in place to pay, of course, the kind of subsidies. Otherwise, and I have not to repeat what Achim said, you get a substantial additional part of your revenue, thanks to the implementation. This it means additional money to subsidize certain incentives. That is maybe more tricky, but otherwise it is ring-fenced. You can measure it better. Thus, I think finally you will win from it. And of course it is evident that countries need to have some assistance. IBFD is doing that on this moment for several countries, but also Achim pointed that out. It is not that you have to mobilize hundreds of people in your tax administration. It is a small group in your large taxpayers. And that is also related to the first question, the scoping. How many of these companies will fall in your jurisdiction? I will skip this one because that is just repeating what is in the rule setting. Now, my last remark is always when you have to consume a different meal. How you will start with it, that means you use your instruments. You use your fork and knife. You are all, and also my background is tax administration, dus your DNA process are your processes. Your processes, and that is also how you tackle such a complicated issue. I think I see some nervous movements here. Is it around the 7 minutes now? Just 2 slides, some considerations, just to how to eat the elephant, always bit by bit. You see, I have something with consumption, with eating. What I see also in many countries is the scoping part, from who will fall in my jurisdiction. Countries like Japan is asking even an organizational chart in the GMT process. That's helpful. Again, you can learn also from each other. Your neighboring countries, peer review, even you can make it in a formal way, because most of the time these multinationals falling in scope are active in different countries. I'm not repeating all this wording we'll see on the slides, we can use it on the panel. One thing is that you can, in the first stage, also rely on, of course, on the tax return in the global minimum tax provided by, most of the time, by the Big Four. Because there's a huge change by the Big Four also in the last 10, 15 years. I think they said goodbye to the aggressive tax planning. They became kind of compliance facilitators. And dus that is your first, say, layer of certainty. You can rely on that. And the data behind. All these multinationals has a pile of data using for different reports. That is your first, I think, a starting point. Dus I want to express that one. There's just another slide, but I'm just afraid for Esther because he's always friendly, but execution is around the corner, 7 minutes. There is one thing, what I want to say here as well. There will be also, especially with some multinationals, there will be, and also maybe between countries, in the dispute resolution area, some uncertainty about existing investment agreements, existing, of course, agreements with the tax administrations. Dus there can be conflicts, there can be interpretations, there can be, of course, MAP procedures involved. Also that we have to consider. I'm not repeating what is on my slide. I think that's enough for this moment, Esther. Good. Good.
Hello, is it working? All right. So I will not make any comments on that because I think what is very important is to provide opportunities for our delegates to interact with the panelists. However, we do have 2 questions for each of them to give us a little bit of perspective. However, now the time has been reduced to half because all of them has not kept to the time. So instead of having 4 minutes each now, they are now having 2 minutes for each of these questions. So then how has HMRC outreach been engaging with agents, industry, and business regarding the implementation of the GMT, and what feedback have you received from these stakeholders?
Okay, thank you, Esther. What a great question, and probably it builds on what I was talking about earlier in terms of obviously setting up a compliance function. We set it up about a year ago, and we're now still 2 years away, or less than 2 years away from the first return. So why have we done that? But that's, I mean, in keeping with some of the themes of what you're going to hear tomorrow as well around promoting compliance. So what we have been doing with the impacting work that we've done, understanding which of our customers are impacted by Pillar 2, we have been contacting them early in what we describe as like one-to-many letters, by trying to both raise awareness and in particular trying to get that buy-in and support the work I'm sure that advisors are doing in terms of at a senior level with this. Noting that I think preparation for Pillar 2 across the population varies quite considerably. Some have developed and are readying themselves for it, whilst others are still quite far back on that journey that Chris described. I think some of the key themes that we're picking out from it, because we now receive, as a result of the engagement that we've done, approximately about 250 queries a quarter at the moment. So quite considerable amounts. A lot of questions and priorities at the moment are on scope, the safe harbors in particular, the qualified CBCR, and various administration issues as well. We are seeing some common misconceptions still, in particular, just some of the ones I'll mention. Still that the headline rate is equivalent to the ETR, which surprises us that still is going round. And also, I don't have 750 million revenue in the UK. And it's like, well, no, again, that's a very basic point. So, but yes, I think there's a variety. We're working closely with advisors as well, because I think we're able to do those queries in bulk, which often impact a much larger customer base. So engagement with agents has been really good. We're getting some very specific questions from the more advanced customers, some clearance requests. But yeah, we expect a lot more to come in the coming months and years as we progress. But I think it just goes to the point of setting up your functions early to engage with customers and agents to hopefully as well build an understanding of the risk profile for ourselves as well in Pillar 2. Thank you.
I think that is really a very good insight for our members who are looking into the implementation of the GMT in the next few years, or even have started. So I think I have another questions for Chris. What challenges do M&E head office tax team face in engaging with their subsidiaries worldwide to meet the Pillar 2 reporting requirements? How can they be resolved?
First of all, thank you very much for that question. I'm tempted to follow Dan's comment of saying, what an excellent question, but given we agreed the questions before, that's probably just thanking ourselves, so I won't do that. So I mean, the question really is, what in relation our multinationals able to do, not at the headquarter location, and you heard from Dan talking about the headquarter location, but actually in each of your locations. And I think that's a real challenge for businesses as well, because business looks at this as a wholly new tax, something overlaid on the top. And much as you heard from Dan that HMRC has got a few people who understand what's actually happening on for Pillar 2, so do businesses. But actually, they've got the added problem that they've got lots of domestic minimum taxes in every single country. So they can't just do a headquarter level. They need to understand it in each of your jurisdictions where you're doing a DMT, a QDMT. I've heard the recent of AMTs, or just where you're just relying on the statutory tax rate being broadly the same or above the 15%. And again, the real challenge for multinationals is that if you've had a centralized approach where you've got all of that control at the center, it's really hard then to look down and give that control back into the subsidiaries. If you've got a central finance function that's doing all of this, this is creating a wholly different approach. And you heard Akim talk about tax incentives, and you heard Victor as well pick up that kind of stuff. When multinationals are looking at that, they're trying to work out whether the tax incentives they've got at the moment are going to last in this kind of environment. Will they last under the income inclusion rules at the top, or will they last under the domestic minimum taxes at the bottom? And of course, they've got to try and work out how it works in every single, as I said, in every single jurisdiction. The way they're doing that, and I will cut my time down really quickly, but they're trying to do that level of training at each level, but they're going to be out asking questions of each of you as to what does your system mean. So whilst you've got the levels at the HQ that can help, that doesn't stop them wanting to ask questions of you, and I think that's going to be the real challenge as we go through this together.
Thank you, Chris. Victor, you talked about the tax incentive earlier, and for the less developed economies, tax incentives are very important to be attractive to FDI. Pillar 2 will change the landscape of and our developing countries could ultimately be victim of this global reform.
Yeah, I said before, I have my doubts about it. First of all, what I said is that many of the tax incentives are probably not needed to be attractive for these foreign direct investments. Secondly, they are not really well monitored, not calculated, not evaluated. I think that was also mentioned before that in many countries I have visited, that tax incentives are sometimes given away without any consent or information by the tax administration. Then we talk about degrees by maybe the Prime Minister or the Ministry of Economic Affairs, or they have investment agencies. That makes it very complicated. So how do you know it works? And it is also in the countries I've been and studied that sometimes, no, often, the majority of multinationals are not paying their income tax or corporate income tax for more than a decade, or can even after an investment period disappear and come back under a different name. I think, therefore, for me, that is really the game changer I mentioned, an open invitation to really go through this. You have to do that anyway, somewhere in time. And I'm not saying that countries will be the victim of it. Because I'm not sure about it. No. I see that Chris has some.
Yes.
I was going to
Chris,
give up
would
my
you
next
want-
question in order to be able to respond to that one, if I may. Is that about
Yes,
Okay.
of course. It's not a rule that who should go first. Yeah, you can
Well,
react to
in that case, let me just pick up that. I mean, incentives is an area where I spent quite a bit of time. I was presenting last week at the UN a paper on the role of tax incentives and the impact of Pillar 2. So it's something where, as Victor says, this is a real opportunity to be engaging on incentives, I mean, looking out at actually how you do this. But there are some really good things that are out there to help you understand and evaluate whether your incentives are worthwhile. And there are different types of incentives that are much more effective, whether they're expenditure incentives compared to profit incentives. You saw some of those obviously not in my slides, but in Victor's slides. But there is some real help out there to try and evaluate. This is an opportunity to go through this. But I think for those who say that the role of incentives are gone, I think that's wrong. Akim mentioned it. The timing incentives there are perfectly possible under Pillar 2. That brings forward the tax deductions for expenditure. So capital investment totally works under the domestic minimum tax. And there are other types of incentives that also work. But you've really got to make sure that you're getting value for money for that. So this is a real opportunity to do so. And there are lots of people who are looking at all that kind of stuff. So I think this is the message I wanted to leave you with is there is a real role for it, and multinationals are looking for it. They will be looking for those kind of things to try and to attract them to your locations, but they need to be designed effectively. Otherwise, you will lose the impact somewhere else.
Thank you. So, yeah.
We're changing. Yeah, we're changing all the rules. We have also to be careful when we talk about this incentive policy related to GMT, that there are also taxpayers not falling in this category. And that can be also domestic taxpayers with the right political connections, making also use of these incentives. Just don't focus only on the multinationals falling in scope of GMT.
That is very right. That we must always remember those who are not impacted by the GMT in the first place, and the tax incentive does make a difference for this group of taxpayers. So before I open to the floor, one last question for Dan. In implementing the new rules, how does HMRC plan to ensure compliance and enforce the new global minimum tax rules? Additionally, what roles does cooperation among tax administrations play in this process? Dan, 2 minutes.
I'll try. No, thank you. Great question. I think firstly, it links from what I was saying before in terms of setting up compliance functions early to understand the risk landscape. So we're putting ourselves in the best position to understand where risk is going to lie even before returns come in. I think I will say though, we are still learning. I think we're all still developing and seeing the moving picture here. I think the final bit to your question, which I really wanted to emphasize, having already discussed about what we've set up within HMRC, how we're engaging externally with advisors and customers, the final one is around how we engage internationally with other tax authorities. And I think in particular, the UK recognises the importance of international collaboration here in terms of Pillar 2 implementation. It's obviously inherently global in design, and I think it's in the interests of tax authorities, businesses, that we all coordinate effectively here. And obviously the UK has established the Pillars knowledge sharing network, and in particular, we're keen to where we can support CATA members when considering their implementations for Pillar 2, understanding their personal experiences, obviously hearing the various voices and experiences that you've got there, and not just hearing from myself about the UK. We want to hear about how we can best support you. So we're keen to listen, build in those sort of peer support networks, perhaps bite-sized approaches, all those types of things. But I think in order to understand how we can best work together on this, it's keen that you do come forward and we can all work together to understand where coordination is kind of best placed and directed.
Thank you, Dan. And we have a very great combination of panelists here, and please take this advantage to ask them questions. We are opening the floor for questions now. So the first one, who would like to ask a question? Or is it too complex, Akim, that I may have to revert back to my earlier opinion about the GMT? Yes. Anyone asking? John? Yes, John.
Thanks, Esther. I found all 4 speakers fascinating, actually. So I'm glad I had the chance to ask the question. Chris, you said, and it's come up this question about the complexity of it and where do you put the function and so on, and you said we're going to have a fairly small specialized unit to handle the introduction of the GMT and the policing of it. Where do you think that should sit in a tax organization? If you're a CG sat here and you're thinking of introducing it, what part of your organization should you be going to? What kind, is it going to be the large business? Is it going to be the transfer pricing? And is there some kind of trade-off? Victor's point about measuring the incentives and the benefits that you get for it. In terms of this, if you're taking officers away to do this, does it mean that you're going to be using, for example, fewer transfer pricing officers? Maybe they'll have a bit more time. And you've got to realize that in these jurisdictions, very often it's the same people running the tax treaty work, also doing the exchange of information work, maybe even doing the transfer pricing work. When you're faced with those kind of staffing challenges, where do you think this is best put to get maximum efficiency from the introduction? Thanks.
John, I have similar questions actually, and I'm actually having this question both for the tax administration as well as for the Big Four. The setup of who is going to deal with this new tax. But Chris, do you want to respond first?
Yeah, let me respond. I'll respond with the various different hats I wear. So in the advice I've been giving with a number of different countries, they've been struggling with exactly that question. Is this a wholly new tax? I'm going to get new people in and sit them somewhere else? Or do I embed them in my organization, and if so, where? The majority of those are looking at those who deal with international tax. But the real challenge is this requires really good understanding of accounting. Or are you just going to trust the accounts? You need to understand accounting as well as you need to understand tax. That's a wholly new skill set for tax administrations. As a Big Four firm, we're also a set of accountants, so we can draw on that skill set. But actually, even for us, that's generally in a different division, and we're having to become a lot better at understanding those kind of things. So drawing those things together. In practice, we're seeing many jurisdictions which are not the headquarters, but those that are having to deal with domestic minimum taxes, setting up initially a group who are just specialists in this tax, and then looking to transition them in 2 years' time into their normal corporate tax regime or their corporate tax area. Because that initial focus up front allows you the ability to train those people in the skill sets that they need. And then over, as you saw or as you didn't see on the slide, there was a 4-year transition for the multinational. I think it's similar also for many of the countries in this room. If you can get your specialists in place, and then you put them later into those things. And if you don't do it specialist at the beginning, then I think you're trying to boil the ocean, and I think that's the real challenge.
Dan?
Thank you. I think it obviously depends on your own organizational design as to precisely how it all comes together, and I think it clearly tailor it to make it work for you. I think a few things just to add to what Chris was saying. Although the first kind of instinct is to say transfer pricing, there are a lot of other things to consider, including accounting, and a lot of the adjustments from book to tax. I mean, that's drawing similarities, but although different rules, to your own sort of corporate income tax and all the adjustments to go at a profit level and then at a tax level as well. You've also got different sectors, and so you'd have, in particular, financial services, you've got shipping, you've got all the different things which potentially in your organization you may have split out somewhere else. So I think one of the main reasons why we have built up this Pillar 2 specialism more in a central area is because we acknowledge that it interacts in different parts of our own organization, and it's about putting those links in place to ensure that it all runs smoothly. So, but I think it will vary depending on your own position.
Thank you, Dan. I don't see any more hands up or flag. Oh, yes. Is that the last question? That would be the last question, right? Okay, the last question.
Hopefully, yeah. But my question is, I think, more of a concern, if I may put it that way. It would appear that, you know, the global minimum tax, the inclusive framework, has been driven at the exclusion of most of us members here, obviously, because it's at the OECD level. And I think the general feeling is that this has got to start now, whether you are part of the inclusive framework or not. And most of us are outside that inclusive framework. Would there be a deliberate measure or attempt to try and adopt some inclusion, transitional arrangement, considering the acknowledged or accepted fact that, you know, it will take a bit of time for us to build capacity, for us to put in place, or the majority of us to put in place, you know, local legislation to comply for mainly those who are outside of the inclusive framework. Would there be a deliberate transitional arrangement put in place to ensure that, you know, those of us who have to build our capacities are cushioned against the loss? Because obviously, if this is taking off now, our taxes will be taxed elsewhere. Our revenues will be taxed elsewhere. And maybe we don't have capacity to safeguard that. Would that be possible? That's my question.
Yeah, thank you. And although Akim has gone to his seat and he's no longer here, but he is still Team Esther. And I think the answer to that question, I need Akim probably to address that.
And I promise I won't speak for another 30 minutes. Thank you for the question. I think first, there is 140 plus countries in the inclusive framework. So sometimes when we say this was done by the OECD and thinking about 38, that's not what we've done. I think there's a lot of designs from many of you in the room, and I can name the colleagues here, including the substance exclusion and somebody who is specifically concerned about hotels, and so that there needed to be an exclusion. Now, I'm not saying this is, but like, there's difference of these aspects, and I see many of you that have had input into the design. I think we have every country that is interested invited also, whether an IF member or not, to these discussions that we're having that I mentioned in Amsterdam. And that's very important also, and I think that's something that Chris, you said, is that the M&Es that are in scope are doing the calculations already today, including for your country, whether you've done something or not, and so we can harvest the benefit that this is happening already together. Now, you mentioned the question, what can we do for countries, I think, that are not members of the inclusive framework as they need to think about it? And that's why I think we're opening up. And I'd be happy to have this conversation also over the coffee break and more what we can do there. Be very specifically, for instance, also on Amount B, that is not limited to IF members. It's available to every country in the world that wants to simplify its transfer pricing rules. We have a number of African countries that are not members of the IF coming to Amsterdam. And so let's work together, and I'm happy I'm here, and then we'll work that out.
Thank you, Akim, and I'd like to thank all of you for your attention and active participation. Thank you for the excellent questions. Thank you to our speaker and panelists. And I think we have to bring this session to a close, and I hand over the session to our MC, but please help me give a warm applause to our excellent panelists. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our panelist, if you allow me, has been strictly moderated to the last minute, just like a football referee in a final match. So, Dr. Hakim, you not only have Team Esther, you also have referee Esther. So, our panelists have rightly provided us with a comprehensive overview of this important initiative, highlighting its goal of promoting fairness in the global tax system and combating base erosion and profit shifting. We have also learned how the global minimum tax aims to establish a baseline for corporate taxation, ensuring that multinationals they contribute a fair share regardless of their jurisdictions.
Moderator, panelists, and distinguished delegates, thank you for your active participation and thought-provoking questions. Your engagement has made this discussion richer and more meaningful. We shall now proceed with the presentation of the token of appreciation offered by the CATA. And may we now also please call upon on stage Dr. Akim Pros, who intervened earlier today. And to present the token, may we please call upon on stage our President of CATA, Dr. Abu Tariq Jamaluddin. So the first token will be presented to our key speaker, Dr. Akim Pros. The next token will be presented to Dr. Esther. Next will be Mr. Dan Jennison. Then we are going to have Dr. Professor Victor van Kommer. Finally, Mr. Chris Sandra. We shall now proceed with the traditional group photo.
In the middle.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we shall now break for tea, and we will be back here in 15 minutes to start the next session. A gentle request to you all, kindly respect the time of 15 minutes as we will be short of time to take the remaining sessions. So thank you very much for today. Thank you.